Hello everyone, welcome to welearn-educ. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. So today we are going to discuss cranial nerves in details. So basically, cranial nerves are nerves that have their origin from within the cranial cavity, and you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Now these cranial nerves supply areas of the head and the neck, with the exception of the vagus nerve that runs deep into the abdomen, supply structures in it. So for cranial nerves, we say they have the origin from the cranial cavity. Then the spinal nerves have the origin from the spinal cord. So these cranial nerves are 12 pairs. The first one being the olfactory, second optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducent, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and the hypoglossal nerve. Now with this section, you're going to look at the main divisions of those cranial nerves, their components, function, and the foramen, other features they use to exit the cranial cavity. Now basically, starting with the divisions, categorization. So these cranial nerves could be categorized into three. First, we have the sensory only, we have motor only, and we have mixed cranial nerves. That means they have both a sensory and a motor function. So starting with the sensory only, so you have those which are only sensory. So for the sensory, there are basically three. That is, we have the first cranial nerve, which is the olfactory, the second, which is the optic, and the eighth, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve. You realize that all these ones play a role as a special sense. So when you come now to the motor only, these are sensory only, then you have motor only. So for motor only, realize that we have the third, the fourth, the sixth, the 11th, and the 12th cranial nerves are motor only, only have a motor nuclei. Then when you come to the mixed cranial nerves, which are the rest of the cranial nerves, so the mixed, we have the trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 5. We have the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve number 7. Then you have the 9th cranial nerve, which is the glossopharyngeal, and the 10th, which is the vagus nerve. So at this point now, we are going to look at each nerve. We look at the main division, as I say, the components, the function, and the foramen and fissures. So at this point, we are going to start with sensory only, motor cranial nerves which are only sensory, and you say there are three. So starting with the first one, which is the olfactory nerve. So the first one, which is the olfactory nerve. So the olfactory nerve basically gives no main division within the cranial cavity, but we say the component is sensory. It's a sensory cranial nerve. And when you come to the function, remember the olfactory is responsible for special sense of smell. That is the olfactory nerve. And how does it exit the cranial cavity? It uses the foramens within the cubiform plate of the ethmoid bone. So that's how it exits the cranial cavity. Now when you come to the second one, which is the optic nerve. The optic nerve, no main division. Component, we say it's only sensory. Then you come to the function, it's responsible for sight. That is, plays a role in the sight. Then when you come to the foramen, it exits the cranial cavity via the optic canal. The optic canal. Then now, when you come now to the, after the eight, that's the third one. So we say the second one is the optic nerve. Then the third one, which is said is the vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve. So the vestibulocochlear nerve gives two main divisions, as the name states, the vestibular part and the cochlear branch. So the divisions, you have the vestibular and you have the cochlear. So starting with the vestibular, both of them are sensory. So starting with now coming to the function, say the vestibular part, look at this for plays a role in balance. Remember when you look at the inner ear, realize that is what you call the saccule and the auricle, responsible for balance within the body. So the vestibular plays a role in balancing, maintaining of balance. When you come to the cochlear part, it plays a role in hearing. For hearing, that is through the organ of Coti. Through the organ of Coti, we realize that hearing could be through the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Now, when you come to how they exit the foramen, how they exit the cranial cavity, realize the exit is through the internal acoustic meatus. That's how they exit the cranial cavity, the internal acoustic meatus. So we've looked at those which are only sensory. Now we are going to look at only motor. So when you come to only motor, so for motor only, which is here, we say that we have the third, the fourth, sixth, and the 11th cranial nerve. Starting with the first one, which is the third cranial nerve, and the third cranial nerve is the oculomotor nerve. So the third cranial nerve, which is the oculomotor nerve, gives no main division in the cranial cavity. This motor and the function it plays, realize that oculomotor nerve plays a role first, controls the eyeball, movement of the eyeball. That means supplies the muscles of the eyeball. That is, we have the rectus, with the exception of the lateral rectus and the inferior oblique muscle. So those are supplied by the oculomotor nerve. Then we shall look at the rest. So now when you come now to the, let's go now the trochlea. Sorry. So this one, we looked at the function, how does it exit the cranial cavity. Realize that it's going to exit the cranial cavity via the superior orbital fissure. Superior orbital fissure, that's why it enters the cranial cavity. Now, let's now go to the fourth cranial nerve. The fourth cranial nerve is what we call the trochlear nerve. A trochlear nerve. So the fourth, so this one is through the superior orbital fissure. Now, that's how it exits the cranial cavity. We looked at the function, but remember the oculomotor nerve plays a role in the pupillary reflex. Remember that is in the pupillary reflex, it plays a role in controlling it. Then also it supplies the cornea. Remember in the corneal reflex, it plays part of it in that function. Those all are the functions of the oculomotor nerve. Now, when you come now to the fourth, which is the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve, main divisions, they're not there. Component, no, but let's come to the function. Now, the trochlear nerve also plays a role in movement of the eyeball, but this time through the superior oblique muscle. This is the superior oblique muscle. That's how it controls the eyeball. Now when you come to the how it exits the cranial cavity, that is to be through the superior orbital fissure. The superior orbital fissure. The same. Now when you come now to the abducent, the sixth. So the sixth cranial nerve, which is the abducent function, it also controls movement of the eyeball. But this movement through controlling of the lateral rectus muscle, movement of the eyeball, exits the cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure. Now, but remember that the superior orbital fissure is a passage for the third, which is the oculomotor, the fourth, which is the trochlear, the sixth, which is the abducent, together with V1, which is the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve. That's a point to note in that. Now let's go to the sixth, finish the sixth, now come into the 11th cranial nerve. So when you come to the 11th cranial nerve, so the 11th, which is the accessory nerve. The accessory nerve. Now this accessory nerve has two main divisions. That is, there's a spinal division and a cranial division. Now all these ones have specific function, but remember they are both motor. So starting with the spinal division. So the spinal division plays a role in controlling two major muscles. That is the sternocleidomastoid. So the function plays in controlling the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius. you realize when you go to the embryology, they both have a common embryologic origin. That's why they're supplied by the same nerve. Now, when you come now to the now, let's go to the cranial branch. So now this cranial is going to play a function that is going to control this specific area. The soft palate, the muscles of the soft palate, then those of the pharynx, then those of the larynx. So muscles of this, but there are exceptions. So from the soft palate, it's not going to supply a muscle known as the tensor belli palatine. So that's the muscle which is not going to supply. We shall see what supplies it when we look ahead. Then for the pharynx, it supplies the muscle section of the sternum, pharyngeus. Then when you come to the larynx, with the exception of the cricothyroid. So those are the functions. So now when you come now to how does it exit the cranial cavity? One thing to note is that the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th cranial nerve exit the cranial cavity through the jugular foramen. So they both exit the cranial cavity through the jugular foramen. That's a point to know, the jugular foramen. That is, when you come to look at the cranial cavity, you see that it's the jugular foramen adjacent to the foramen magnum. So that's the jugular foramen. So exit through the jugular foramen. Then let's come to the 12th cranial nerve. So now for the 12th cranial nerve, which is the hypoglossal nerve. So the hypoglossal nerve the function it supplies muscles of the tongue. Supplies the muscles of the tongue. The extension of the supplies the muscles of the tongue. Then how does it exit the cranial cavity? That is through the jugular foramen. Hypoglossal foramen. Sorry for the X. It's the hypoglossal foramen. That is the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal foramen. So that we've looked at the motor only. Now we're going to come to our last group, which is the mixed nerves. And pay close attention to this because they have many details with it. So coming to the mixed nerve, we say the first one is the trigeminal nerve. So the first one is the trigeminal nerve. So the 5th cranial nerve, which is the trigeminal nerve, gives three main divisions. Remember, we said these are mixed nerves. They have a motor and a sensory supply. But you shall also find there the parasympathetic supply through the glands of the head. So now coming with the 5th cranial nerve, that is the trigeminal, we say it gives three main divisions. That is, you have V1, which is the ophthalmic. Then you have what? V2, which is the maxillary. Then we have V3, which is the mandibular branch. So let's start with the first branch, is the ophthalmic. Remember I said the ophthalmic exits the cranial cavity, if you remember, through the superior orbital fissure. So if we've already cleared this. So now we come into the function. Remember, these two are sensory. They have a sensory only, but this V3 has a motor and a sensory supply. Not that. So let's come to the function of the ophthalmic. Now remember, one thing to know, that trigeminal nerve is a sensory supply of the muscles of the sensory to the face and the scalp. Not that. So it supplies the region of the foreface. Then it supplies the skin over the eyelids. Then other parts of the face. Now when you come to the maxillary, it's also sensory, but this time areas around the maxilla bone. Supplies sensory to that area. Then one thing to note, it also supplies the cavities, the nasal area, cavities in the nasal, in the nose, supplied by the maxillary nerve. Then let's come to the mandibular. Now let's look at the point they exit the cranial cavity. We said this one is the superior orbital fissure. When you come to the maxillary, it exits through the foramen rotundum, Then you come to the mandibular branch. This mandibular branch, we say it has, let's first look at this in details. The V3 branch. So V3, we say it's both mixed and it has what? The motor and the sensory supply. So V3, first we say, starting with the sensory, supplies the skin over the cheek, supplied by it. Then it also supplies muscles of the mastication. I'm going to note that muscles of the mastication, that is supplied by the V3. How it exits the cranial cavity, that is through foramen ovale. So that's how it exits the cranial cavity. We shall look for the other details later. Now let's go to the 7th cranial nerve. So for the 7th cranial nerve, which is the facial nerve, So now this facial nerve gives no main divisions, but we shall realize that in its course, it gives divisions when outside the cranial cavity. It gives other, but now we are going to concentrate in the cranial cavity. Now let's look at the components. It's mixed. It's a mixed what? Nerve. Now, starting with the function. So let's look at the sensory aspect. Remember the facial nerve is going to supply the anterior 2/3. That is the sensation of the 2/3 of the tongue. It's going to be supplied by the facial nerve, the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Now, when you come to the motor aspect, it supplies muscles of the face, facial expression. All the muscles of facial expression supplied by the facial nerve. Even the platysma by its branch, supplied by the facial nerve. Now, when you come now to the sensory motor aspect, look at the sensory, look at the motor, the sensory motor aspect, that is to the parasympathetic supply. Supplies the glands. First of all, to supply the submandibular gland, sublingual gland. Supply also the lacrimal gland. Then also glands within the nasal area, supplied by the facial nerve. But what point to note is that the parotid gland is not supplied by the facial nerve. It's not supplied by the facial nerve. So now we shall look. Now let's go to the looked at now. Now how does it exit the cranial cavity? So note this. It's going to first exit through the internal acoustic meatus, then through the facial canal, then lastly through the stylomastoid foramen. The stylomastoid foramen. That's how it will exit to come out of the cranial cavity. So to exit through that, first of all, they say that through the internal acoustic meatus, then through the facial canal, then lastly through the stylomastoid foramen. So that's how the facial nerve exits the cranial cavity. Now let's go to the 9th, which is the glossopharyngeal. So for the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9, which is the glossopharyngeal. Now this glossopharyngeal, where no main division component is mixed. Now let's look at the function of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So the glossopharyngeal nerve, let's look at the sensory. Sensory supplies the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, but it's going to supply both taste and general sensation. Note that the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Then you come to other supplies is that for sensory. Then you come to motor. So now for the motor aspect, this glossopharyngeal, let's look at the motor and the sensory. So for the motor aspect, last time when you're discussing the supply by the accessory nerve, there are some exception. Remember with the exception of the right here, the tensor palatine, that's supplied by the glossopharyngeal. Then when you come now to the sensory aspect, to supply the parotid gland. That's the exception. By the parotid, supply the parotid gland. Now how does this one exit? I said the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th exit through the jugular foramen. That's how it exits the cranial cavity. Now, lastly, we shall look at the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve, I said, it runs till the abdomen supply structures there. But now this vagus nerve, we realize that it's going to supply the pharynx, the larynx. Remember the recurrent laryngeal branches of the vagus, they supply the larynx, the trachea, sorry. Then as it runs to the abdomen supply structures, for example, remember the splenic flexure. The splenic flexure. So for the GIT, it will run and supply the GIT via until the splenic flexure. Now that splenic flexure is that point at when you're the anterior, the proximal 2/3 of the transverse colon and the distal 1/3 of the transverse colon. That's what the point I'm talking about. That's why its supply will end of the vagus nerve. So that's the supply of the vagus nerve. So now, I think at this point, also what the vagus nerve supply to supply the heart itself, and the great vessels to be supplied by the vagus nerve. Remember the contour of the heart to be supplied by the vagus nerve. So how does this exit the cranial cavity? I said through the jugular foramen. But at this point, since you've looked at all, I want to thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.